Okay, so we just finished talking about human language and how it's different, but there's also these sort of four, I think four, yeah, a couple of things that I want you to know about language, and that's the things that linguistic anthropologists, if we were all linguistic anthropologists, things that they would be particularly interested in knowing. So the first kind of level of speech that we study is called phonology. Okay, that's the actual sounds that a language is capable of making. So if you anybody who's even spoken to somebody that speaks a different language, you've probably noticed that other languages have sounds that we just do not have in English. One of them, the most common one that my students know, is the rolling R in Spanish. You know, they roll their R's. We don't do that. We just don't have that repeating sound. In Korean, most of the sounds in the Korean alphabet also exist in the English alphabet, with a couple of exceptions. But for the most part, these sounds match up pretty well to sounds that you might find in the English language. So it's actually not that hard to learn how to read and write in Korean. But Vietnamese is totally different. So Vietnamese used to use they used to use Chinese characters to write their language. But when France took over Vietnam for a short period, they switched to the sort of not Romanization. Excuse me, I'll spit it out here in a second. So they Romanized the language so that they're using these Roman letters, the same letters we use, to try to display the sounds that Vietnamese makes. However, Vietnamese has all of these different sounds in their language that they just don't have in French and we don't have in English, and so there's not a corresponding letter. It's also a tonal language. So if you say the same sound in a rising intonation, like I just did, or a downward intonation, like I just did, it changes the actual meaning of the word. Chinese is also like this. Korean, luckily, is not tonal, so I didn't have to worry about memorizing different tones. But it's hard to represent tones with this Romanized language, right? So they have all these funny little squiggles right above certain letters that let you know if you're supposed to say a rising intonation, a downward intonation, or a up and then a downward intonation. It's pretty complicated. But anyway, the point is that these are all examples of phonology, the study of speech sounds, what sounds are in the language. So the second one, we're moving up the chain of language and getting a little bit more complicated. The first level of language study was phonology, the sounds of a language. Now we're talking about morphology. That's this word over here, morphology. The area of language dealing with how meaningful bits are created and manipulated by the combination of language sounds. So we're no longer talking about individual sounds like the rolling R or anything like that. We're talking about the combination of those sounds. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll, but I've uploaded a YouTube video and I'd like you to pause and listen to it. There's also a link right here. So pause this discussion and listen to that, please. Okay, hopefully you did pause this video and you did listen to the Jabberwocky. But here, you'll notice as they're reciting this poem that a lot of these words don't mean anything in the English language. Mimsy is not a word. Brillig is not a word. Slithy toves. The frumious bandersnatch. Mansom foe he sought. The tum tum tree. So these words as they are don't mean anything in the English language. Yet, when we listen to the poem, we get an image, and we get an image that what a tum tum tree might look like. A slithy tove sounds a little bit like a swamp, and even though he never says that he's fighting a great beast and that he's in a swamp and that there's tum tum trees, and he never says any of these things really directly. And in fact, most of this is not English. Almost every other word is gobbledygook. It doesn't mean anything. We still nonetheless come away with a little bit of a feeling and an imagery in our heads. And that's because we know, just having known enough English and being, most of us are probably English language natives, we know how certain sounds come together and that they create a feeling. Slithy, the word slithy right here sounds like slippery and slithering and snake. And so we get a sort of image from that, right? And so morphology, and Lewis Carroll, who wrote the Jabberwocky that you just listened to, is an expert in morphology. And he's so good at it that he's able to manipulate it and write this poem that's complete gibberish. But because you and I are all native language speakers, or at least good enough with the English language that we can define meaning, right? We are able to extract meaning from this gibberish. Did you know that you were such a English language expert? I bet you didn't. I bet you didn't realize how good at English you were. So the next two aspects of language that you would study if you were a linguistic anthropologist is grammar and syntax. So grammar and syntax are the rules in a language for how words are combined to make intelligible utterances. So at first we were talking about the sounds of speech, right? Just the individual sounds that are possible. Then we talked about how to combine those sounds to create meaning, and you can create meaning even if you're not creating a word that's in a dictionary. You can just create meaning via the sounds put together in a specific way. But now we're talking about words and how you can combine those to make something that no one's ever heard before, or just to create a sentence that people can understand. Okay, so here in my example, I'm gonna keep trying to convince you that you're actually a master linguist, and you might not have even known it. So this is when I would call somebody on the class and say, can anybody read number one right here? And of course, everybody can read it. Most people can read this. I like to listen to music when I walk in the park. Now, you may not think about it because you can just sit here and read this, but if you were a non-native speaker, if you were learning English, you wouldn't be able to, or you'd have a hard time being able to figure out where the pauses are. How does one sound blend into the next, and where are the words? And you'd have to know the rules of grammar and syntax in order to decipher this and create meaning. Just as in, this is Korean. This is a Korean sentence that I've written. It says, 나는 공원에서 산책할 때 음악을 듣는 좋아해요. And all that means is, I like to listen to music in the park. Or, I'm sorry, I like to listen to music when I walk in the park. And all the words are pushed together, but I'm not native in the Korean language at all, but I do know enough Korean that I'm able to decipher this, and I know when to stop and when to pause, and which letters are combined how. So here's another example. See if you can read this by yourself. It doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letters be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. So again, this is something that would be really, really difficult for somebody that was learning English for the first time, or not totally fluent, to be able to read. But you and I can read these just fine. Now moving on to syntax. So the English language is subject, verb, object. Typically, we would say, Yoda grasped the lightsaber. That would mean that Yoda reached out and grabbed his weapon, right? But other languages are not always in this order, right? They don't use this same syntax and grammar. A lot of languages like Korean and Japanese are subject, object, verb. And so in the Korean language, you would say, Yoda, the lightsaber grasped. Now in English, that has a totally different meaning than Yoda grabbed the lightsaber. In English, it sort of sounds like Yoda the lightsaber grasped. It sounds like the lightsaber grabbed Yoda. But in Korean, this is perfectly intelligible. Other languages, Hawaiian, Celtic, they would say verb, subject, object. That's grasped Yoda the lightsaber. And then when George Lucas, who made Star Wars, was trying to find a way to make Yoda sound alien, to make him sound very, very different than other people without having to use subtitles and create a language for him, he found this language in the Amazonia, that he sort of mimicked in order to create Yoda, the way that Yoda talks, to make him sound alien or foreign to American listeners, but not necessarily having to make them read subtitles. So he talks like object, subject, verb. The lightsaber Yoda grasped. I'm going to pause there